I'm putting this airplane together. I've been pretty careful, some might say anal, about making sure that everything on here is either powder coated, painted, or protected with cosmoline, peralkatone, or some other type of dielectric that'll keep parts from rusting, to protect them from rusting and prevent galvanic corrosion. One of the issues with doing that is that you wind up without a guaranteed ground. Now, I think I might have said that before. I don't remember. This project is making me old. Not that my memory has anything to do with age, but at least I have an excuse now. They say memory is not the first thing to go, but I don't remember what is. Anyhow, because of that, I can't guarantee that I get a good ground, a chassis ground, or ground through all the tubing and stuff from, say, the engine and the firewall into the main fuselage and all of that. One of the things I've discovered over the years, or discovered years ago when I was doing a lot of work with electronics and stuff, and then on cars and things like that, is that a bad ground, is the source of a lot of electrical problems on things. Most things like this run a chassis ground or common ground on things, but like on a car, if you have a common ground, your engine is grounded to the chassis and into the battery like that, is ground goes to that, and what happens is as it ages, you start getting corrosion between the parts, and so your ground routes either become corroded, they get a high resistance on them, so they have more of a load on them. You don't get as good a ground as what you should, and so things don't work the way they should. These new cars are especially bad about that with the computers. They depend on sensors and a current flow for a lot of things. I could have problems potentially on here because the engine mount grounds through the bolts. We've got fiber washers that go between the firewall and this pad right here on the engine mount, on the airframe side of the engine mount. There's a fiber washer there, and then there's one on the firewall side of the engine mount that keeps a good ground connection from happening there. The bolts run through, and they would give you a good ground, but again, grease those up with peralkatone to make sure to keep them from rusting, from seasoning these holes, and that'll reduce the connectivity, the conductivity of that bolt, between the bolt and the airframe. So we've got other sources that ground can run through. You've got 4 of those bolts, of course, but you wind up with things like the control cables wind up being a ground route, and the primer lines wind up being a ground route, and some things like that. And because I've got those all pretty well insulated and isolated where they go through different places, they might be kind of a long ground route. To help with that, to mitigate that a little bit, this isn't a replacement for a heavy ground, but I've got this small ground strap here that I made up earlier for something else and didn't use it, and I've got this penetration here with this little number 4 screw through the firewall that holds an 8L clamp on there, a cable clamp on there for the cable for the alternator. Comes from the regulator of the alternator. Anyway, that's a firewall penetration there, and so I put this ground cable, this little ground wire underneath that gives a good contact on that firewall, so I can run that through there and then down. There's these little tabs welded on this diagonal here on the front, and I didn't know what those tabs were before, and I just used them as a ground point. Well, it turns out there's 2 tabs there, and therefore the control lock, it hinges on there, pivots on there, and then it drops down, and there's supposed to be a little catch on the firewall down here. It drops down and catches in, and then you reach down and grab it, swing it up, and hook it over the control stick for control lock. Well, with this deep instrument panel on here, that control lock would never work on there. I used these for a ground point, and I drilled that hole out, oversized, put a nut zert in there, so that's got a good positive connection, and then I've got a brass stud screwed in there, and that's what I've used for all my ground connections. I've got the one here on this side, and I split it. Some of the stuff is over on the other one on the other side, so that's my ground connection. That gives me a good chassis ground right there. So I'm going to go ahead and take this ground wire, this braid right here, and that'll come from the firewall, and I'll just tie it right into this chassis ground right here, and that'll give me a good positive ground between the firewall and the chassis here with the fuselage. Hopefully it won't be the only ground path, but that'll be a good direct ground path. And I'll have to do something on between the engine and the firewall also, so everything on the engine has a good positive ground to it. Now they've got a ground connection between the magnetos and the ground over here, because they have a shielded wire that's grounded on the magneto and comes through the firewall and gets grounded here on the pins on the other side. And then of course you've got the magneto switch, which is a ground, and that grounds out the magnetos. That comes from ground, goes through there too, but the shielded wire is grounded through from the engine, from the magneto to there. But that's not enough to carry the full current load of like the battery and the alternator both need a good positive ground connection. Okay, that braided ground wire is hooked up there now to that, and I've got all of the wires hooked back up to it, so that gives me a good positive connection between the firewall and the fuselage here now.